Welcome to the channel, which covers physiology, pharmacology, image analysis and image processing. A while ago I made a video on COVID-19 and the way in which the virus infects our cells. In that video I talked about ACE2, which is the enzyme that the virus attacks. In this video I wanted to return to that topic and this time talk to some experts, some friends that I have who work in science and can help us to shed a little bit of light on whether or not this enzyme really is a receptor. What is the Renin Angiotensin System? What is the normal role of ACE2? And what's the importance of the lungs? The blood vessels in the lungs, called the pulmonary circulation, clearly can be a target for the virus. What consequences might it have for our physiology if the blood vessels of the lungs became infected by the virus? We'll speak to the experts and we'll find out. Here's just a quick literature search using PubMed, which is where we would typically go to search the scientific literature. The search terms, as you can see here, are ACE2 and COVID-19. You could use Sars-cov-2 equally. The results are displayed in publication date, order of publication date. There are 2,075 results, and these are papers that were just published this year. So this is over 2,000 papers published about the connection between SARS-CoV-2 and ACE2, but there will be many, many more papers than that, depending on what search terms you use. So the purpose of this is just to show there's a huge body of literature at the moment around the connection between SARS-CoV-2 virus and the ACE2 enzyme that we would find in the cardiovascular system and in endothelial and epithelial cells. So here is a cell infected by coronavirus. The virus particles are shown in yellow. The virus has spikes around its surface that give the impression of a corona. And these spikes attach to the ACE2 enzyme. And the enzyme is normally found on the surface of endothelial or epithelial cells. And so that enzyme is the target for the viral spikes. Okay, so is this a receptor? Is ACE2 a receptor or is it an enzyme? Or is it both? What's the correct terminology? And how do our cells make proteins or enzymes? Let's ask Dr. Dorothy Agilis from STEM Scotland. Hello, Dr. Dorothy Agilis, pharmacologist, teacher and director now of STEM Scotland. Thanks very much for taking the time out today to join me on this little video. And I wondered if you could help us to understand, at a very basic level, how does a cell actually make a protein? What's inside the cell that enables it to make a protein?
Okay, good question. So in all of our cells, we have the nucleus, which controls what the cell does, and everything outside the nucleus that's bound by the outer membrane. So in the nucleus, we have DNA, which contains the genes that make all the proteins our cells need. And the genes are composed of DNA, which is a molecule that's composed of little units that appear in a particular order. And it's the order of those units that will determine the order of the amino acids that make our proteins. So the whole thing starts in the nucleus. And I'm just going to share a little diagram that might make it a wee bit clearer. The overall process is here for how a cell makes a protein. So we go from DNA to another big molecule called RNA in the nucleus. And that RNA then travels out the nucleus to make the protein. The order of these letters on the DNA molecule, so it's like a little template, determines the order of the RNA units that line up opposite their matching pairs. So it's like a pairing thing. So basically you go from DNA to RNA and that all happens in the nucleus of the cell. So now the mature transcript travels out little pores in the nuclear membrane to the cytoplasm. And this is where the protein synthesis takes place. here we have the mRNA with the code, the bases, and these little RNA bases here on the transfer RNA, which transports amino acids, will line up opposite the appropriate letter or code here. The code from DNA is transcribed to RNA, and that is then translated into protein. So it's all to do with the order of these little bases which provide the code. And the order of these will determine the order of amino acids, which determines the protein that is made.
So it sounds from what you're saying then that cells invented copy and paste.
I guess you could say that, but they also can make mistakes sometimes, which that's a whole other interesting topic. But yes.
The protein, the ACE2, is an enzyme, but is it also a receptor?
Basically, it's both correct. ACE2 is both a receptor and an enzyme. So for ACE2, it's a particular protein which functions as an enzyme because it can convert one molecule into another by cleaving or cutting part of the molecule. So it converts one thing into another. But this particular shape of the ACE2 protein is one that is recognized by the virus SARS-CoV-2. So it's a recognition. The ACE2, although it functions as an enzyme in its biological function, it acts as a recognition site that SARS-CoV-2 will recognize and bind to. And because this binding is what we would think of as a receptor type action, where we have a molecule that something else recognizes and binds to.
Okay.
So it's both.
Okay, so I think I need to now go and find out a little bit more about ACE2 and the Renin Angiotensin System. And I've got somebody in mind that I'm going to phone another one of my science friends. But for now, listen, all I can say is thanks very much. Best of luck with STEM Scotland, and I'll speak to you again soon, I hope.
Absolutely. Look forward to it. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so having established that the enzyme can be a receptor, what is the role of angiotensin 2 and ACE2 normally in the circulation? That's all part of the Renin Angiotensin system, and that's the system that the virus attacks. We're now going to talk to Professor James Docherty from Dublin and ask him about a paper that he's recently published on the role of the Renin Angiotensin system, and specifically COVID-19, the SARS virus, and ACE2. Professor Jim Docherty from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. I know you recently published a paper on the Renin Angiotensin system, and I wondered if you could just give us a brief overview about the Renin Angiotensin system and its role in the systemic circulation.
So this shows a diagram of the effects of co-virus on the balance of the angiotensin converting enzymes. Now, angiotensin 1, the precursor, is converted by ACE1 to angiotensin 2, and this is the pro-inflammatory hormone acting on the lung to cause inflammation, making it more difficult to breathe. The ACE2 pathway, again from angiotensin 1, produces several mediators that are anti-inflammatory, opposing the effects of angiotensin. So we have this balance normally between the pro-inflammatory ACE1 products and the anti-inflammatory ACE2 products. But COVID virus binds to ACE2, it knocks out most of the ACE2. So all of a sudden you've lost the normal equilibrium and you end up in a situation where greater stimulation of inflammation and you have this inflammatory cascade in the lung.
That increase in ACE1 then, presumably that leads to higher levels of angiotensin 2, and we know that the angiotensin 2 is a very potent vasoconstrictor. And so what consequences might that have for the systemic circulation?
Well, of course, you'll have rises in blood pressure because of the angiotensin 2. So you're stressing the system. You're changing the balance in that you're getting more causing rises in blood pressure, causing even at the tissue level, a tendency to filter more fluids. You're going to get part of the pro-inflammatory response because of the increased blood pressure. COVID, by knocking out ACE2, does shift things to the red pathway, the pro-inflammatory pathway. And the problem was the suggestion that perhaps drugs acting on the ACE1 enzyme pathway, the angiotensin 2 receptor pathway, might shift the balance towards ACE2, causing more ACE2 enzyme, which would be more of a target for COVID.
Yeah.
But the evidence isn't there. It does not seem to be the case that people on these drugs are any more at risk of infection by the virus. There is actually evidence beginning to emerge that people who are on these antagonists, either of the enzyme or of the receptor, may actually have some beneficial effects in fighting against COVID by reducing this pro-inflammatory pathway.
It's interesting to hear that connection between the renin angiotensin system and the COVID virus, because that's the one thing that really sparked my interest here was when I heard about the virus targeting ACE2, and I thought, gosh, this isn't a respiratory disease. This is actually a vascular disease, or is it both a vascular disease and a
respiratory? Yes. Yeah. If you think of the normal situation in the lungs, the alveolus with the air is very close to the blood capillary. It allows very easy exchange of oxygen into the blood and carbon dioxide out of the blood. If you have the inflammatory response to angiotensin, you get a leaky endothelium in the capillary, fluid builds up, you're getting swelling of the interstitium, there's a greater distance between the alveolus and the capillary, making it harder to absorb oxygen.
Okay.
And then things can get worse. The fluid builds up and builds up until the pressure is positive in the interstitium between the cells. And this causes fluid to move into the alveolus through the leaky alveolar membrane. It then becomes very difficult to breathe.
Okay. And that makes sense now why so many countries were desperate to get their hands on respiration pumps.
Exactly, yes.
For the wards. Okay, well, thanks very much, Jim. That's been very useful, and it's helped to clear up a lot about the relationship between the virus and the renin angiotensin system, and whether or not it's a vascular disease or a respiratory disease. And as you've told us there, it's a bit of both. So thanks very much.
Thank you. It's been very enjoyable. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Bye. Okay, so now we know about the renin angiotensin system and the normal role of ACE2, angiotensin 2, and angiotensin 1 to 7. But we know that this is a respiratory disease. But we know that it also has cardiovascular effects. Now, given that the lungs, where the respiration happens, also have blood vessels, the pulmonary circulation, you can imagine that if your lungs become infected, then both the airways and the pulmonary blood vessels can be affected by the virus. What would be the consequence of being infected by the virus? What would be the consequences for the pulmonary circulation? And for this, I'm going to speak to Dr. Angus Shaw, who's an expert in pulmonary pharmacology. I'm joined by Dr. Angus Shaw, an expert in pulmonary pharmacology, who used to work at Glasgow Caledonian University. So thanks for joining us today, Angus.
You're welcome.
Now, we've heard about ACE2, how it is produced in the endothelial cells, and we've learned a little bit about the systemic circulation. I wondered if I could ask you a bit about the pulmonary circulation. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what it is that's special about the pulmonary circulation.
Well, the pulmonary circulation is a unique circulation. It's distinct from the systemic circulation. And the function of the pulmonary circulation is to direct venous blood from the systemic circulation to the gas exchange units in the lung. And we get oxygenation of the blood, which is then returned back to the systemic circulation, and it supplies the body cells.
And it's under considerably lower pressure than the systemic circulation, that's right?
That's right. For the lungs to function properly, then the pulmonary circulation requires a much lower pressure than you would get in the high pressure systemic circulation.
And so that's why we tend to think of the pulmonary circulation and the systemic circulation as being quite different. That's what we would teach the students.
That's right, yeah. The other unique feature of the pulmonary circulation is that the pulmonary arteries can constrict when the level of oxygen in the lung is reduced. We call that hypoxia. So we get hypoxic vasoconstriction in the lung.
Okay. And so we've got in the lung then, we have blood vessels alongside the airways. The airways have epithelial cells, which are known to express ACE2, which is the target for the virus. And we presume also, therefore, that the pulmonary blood vessels also have ACE2 in their endothelium, which is a target for the virus. And the virus is believed to activate or to tag on to the ACE2 and cause it to downregulate. So what I'm wondering is, what would be the consequences for the pulmonary circulation if ACE2 was to be downregulated as in response to an attack by the virus?
Well, if we lose ACE2, then obviously we also lose angiotensin 1-7, which has counter effects to angiotensin 2. So the net effect of the virus would be that angiotensin 2 would predominate. And so we would have an unregulated activation of the angiotensin 2 response. So the question is, what would angiotensin do in the lungs? And if we think about that, if we restrict it to the endothelium, then angiotensin 2 can activate endothelium. And that has a number of effects. One of the effects is that you lose vasodilators that are produced by the endothelium. And so the pulmonary blood vessels constrict, and that increases pressure. The second thing that can happen is that the endothelium can contract. And when the endothelium contracts, it leaves gaps between the different endothelial cells, and that allows fluid to leak out of the blood vessel into the surrounding cells. The third thing that can happen is that white cells that are needed for inflammatory response and for immune responses circulate in the blood. And they don't leave the blood because the endothelium doesn't allow them to leave, but they can if the endothelium is activated. And the endothelium can grab hold of white cells or leukocytes by expressing adhesion proteins when they're activated. So that allows white cells to move out of the blood vessels and into the surrounding tissue. The fourth feature of endothelial cells is that they normally prevent blood clotting. But when they're activated, then they can express coagulation factors that promote blood clots. And if we get blood clots in the blood, obviously, then that restricts blood flow. So if angiotensin 2 is unregulated, then we can get overactivation of the endothelial cells, and we get these responses that I've just described.
Okay, so it's pretty serious then. It sounds like quite a complex response.
It's a complex response, very complex. And of course, all of the effects that I've just described, we see in the patients with the Sars-cov-2 virus.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so there we are. We've spoken to the experts, and you'll agree, I hope, that it's very complex, a very serious disease if you do become infected by the virus. I hope you enjoyed that video, or at least you got some interesting information from it. Subscribe if you would like me to make some more of these types of videos. Give it the usual thumbs up, and we're over 500 subscribers now. I'm absolutely delighted by that. I would like to keep making more videos, and if we get more subscribers, then I'm happy to keep making these types of educational science videos. And we'll do another image analysis one soon. Okay, see you next time.